The richest people on the planet are drowning in debt, not because they're broke, because they know something most people never figure out. What if debt wasn't the enemy? What if avoiding it entirely was actually the mistake? Here's the contrast nobody talks about. The average person works 40 years to pay off a house. A wealthy investor uses the bank's money to buy 10 of them. Same bank, same debt, completely opposite outcome. One person ends up with a paid-off home and a retirement account that barely covers groceries. The other builds a portfolio worth millions, using money that was never his to begin with. Think about this number. The top 1% of Americans hold roughly 32% of all wealth, and nearly 60% of that wealth was built using leverage, using debt. So why are you being told to avoid it at all costs? And here's the real question. What if the way you were taught to think about money was specifically designed to keep you from getting wealthy? Stay with this, because what comes next will completely change how you see every financial decision you make. Here's what most people believe. Debt is dangerous. You pay it off as fast as possible. You save up before you buy anything. You live below your means and stay out of the red. Sounds logical, and it's not entirely wrong. Consumer debt, credit cards, car loans, personal spending, that is dangerous. But people don't stop there. They lump everything together. All debt becomes the enemy. And this is where most people get stuck. Because the moment you decide all debt is bad, you automatically disqualify yourself from the tools wealthy people use every single day. Let's be honest. Most people learned about money from their parents. Who learned from their parents? Who lived through recessions and credit disasters and hard times. That fear got passed down, not as advice, as instinct. The problem is the world changed. The strategies didn't. You're still running software from 1972 in a 2025 economy. Here's the flaw. Avoiding debt doesn't make you safe. It makes you slow. And in a world where inflation is quietly shrinking your savings every single year, slow doesn't mean cautious. Slow means falling behind. This is where most people fail. Not because they spent too much, but because they played defense their entire financial life, while wealthy people were running plays. What most people miss is this. Not all debt is the same. There is debt that costs you money, and there is debt that makes you money. Those are not the same thing. Treating them like they are is one of the most expensive mistakes a person can make. Here's the difference. You put $5,000 on a credit card at 20% interest. You don't pay it off at the end of the month. That debt now costs you $1,000 a year just to exist. It produces nothing. It creates nothing. It slowly drains you. That is bad debt. Full stop. Now, picture a different scenario. You borrow $200,000 at a 7% mortgage rate. You purchase a rental property. That property generates $2,000 a month in rent. Your mortgage payment is $1,300. You're clearing $700 a month. Every month, using money the bank gave you. The debt didn't cost you. The debt paid you. That is good debt. And wealthy people are obsessed with it. Now here's the part people overlook. While that tenant is paying your mortgage, the property is also appreciating. Historically, real estate in the U.S. has appreciated roughly 3 to 4% annually. So on a $200,000 property, that is $6,000 to $8,000 in value added every year. That you didn't earn by working. That just happened because you own the asset, and you own that asset because you were willing to take on debt. Let's make this even clearer. You're probably wondering how this math works at scale. Let's say you use $20,000 as a down payment on a rental property. You control a $200,000 asset with 10% down. That property goes up in value by 4%. 4% of $200,000 is $8,000. But you only put in $20,000. So your actual return on that investment is 40%. 40% on a year where the market returned maybe 10. That's leverage. That's what debt does when it's used correctly. And here's the breakthrough. Rich people don't love debt because they like owing money. They love it because it multiplies their purchasing power without requiring more of their own capital. Now let's talk about why this feels so wrong. There's a psychological reason most people can't do what wealthy investors do. And it has nothing to do with intelligence. It has everything to do with how the brain is wired to handle risk. Research in behavioral economics has shown something uncomfortable. Humans feel the pain of a loss about twice as intensely as the pleasure of an equivalent gain. So when you think about borrowing $200,000, your brain is not calculating the potential upside. It's screaming about everything that could go wrong. The tenant who doesn't pay, the roof that collapses, the market that drops, the bank that calls the loan. Your brain runs every worst-case scenario at full volume, and your body responds. Heart rate, anxiety, avoidance. The truth is, wealthy people feel that too. The difference is they've learned to separate emotion from strategy. They do the math first. They stress test the numbers, and then they act. Not because they're fearless, because they've trained themselves to distrust fear as a financial advisor. There's a name for what most people experience when they think about taking on debt. It's called status quo bias. The brain interprets any change from the current state as a potential threat, even when the current state is quietly failing you. So you stay in the same job. You keep the same savings account. You tell yourself you'll invest when things feel more certain. But here's what nobody tells you. Certainty never comes. The market is never perfectly timed. The rate is never perfectly low. The moment is never perfectly right. Wealthy people don't wait for certainty. They build systems that can survive uncertainty. And that is a completely different approach. Let's be clear about something. Wealthy people are not reckless. They're not gambling. They're not taking blind risks. They are being deeply strategic. They evaluate cash flow before they commit. They calculate their debt service coverage ratio. They build in buffers for vacancies, repairs, rate changes. They treat debt like a tool. And like any tool, it requires skill to use safely. Here's something even more interesting. The ultra-wealthy don't just use debt to buy assets. They use debt to avoid selling assets. Think about that. If you own a stock worth $500,000 and you need cash, most people would sell, which triggers capital gains tax, which could cost you $70,000 to $100,000 in taxes, depending on your bracket. A wealthy investor borrows against the stock instead, tax-free, because borrowed money is not taxable income. They get the cash. They keep the asset. They pay no tax. And here's the part that really stings. This is completely legal. Banks offer it routinely. It's called a securities-backed line of credit. And most regular people have never heard of it. You're probably wondering, what about interest rates? Aren't they too high right now? Fair question. Here's the real answer. Interest rates matter. But what matters more is the spread. The spread is the gap between what your debt costs you and what your investment returns. If you borrow at 7% to buy an asset returning 12%, you're profiting 5% on money that isn't yours. Every single year, multiply that by $200,000. That's $10,000 a year in pure spread, generated from borrowed capital. This is why sophisticated investors don't panic when rates rise. They adjust their target returns. They find different asset classes. They renegotiate. They wait for better entry points. What they do not do is walk away from the strategy entirely, because the strategy is not tied to a specific rate. It's tied to the spread. Now let's talk about something most people never consider. Inflation. When you borrow a fixed amount today and inflation runs at 3% per year, you are repaying that loan in future dollars that are worth less than today's dollars. In other words, inflation is quietly eroding the real cost of your debt. Every year you hold it, on a $200,000 mortgage over 30 years, at 3% annual inflation, the real value of what you owe drops by nearly half by the time you finish paying. You borrowed $200,000 in today's money. You repaid it in tomorrow's cheaper money. Wealthy people understand this deeply. They use long-term fixed debt as a hedge against inflation, while average people save cash that inflation quietly eats alive. Think about what that actually means in practice. You have $50,000 sitting in a savings account earning 4%. Inflation is running at 3.5%. Your real return after inflation is barely 0.5%. Meanwhile, someone else borrowed $200,000 at a fixed rate, bought an asset that appreciates and generates income. And inflation is literally shrinking the real weight of their debt every single year. Same economy, completely opposite position. And this is where everything changes. Look at the largest corporations on the planet. Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Tesla. Every single one carries billions in long-term debt. Apple, at various points, has carried over $100 billion in debt, while simultaneously holding hundreds of billions in cash. Why would a company that rich borrow money? Because their debt costs them 3%, and they invest that money to generate 15. So they pocket the 12% difference. At scale, the rich don't pay off debt. They optimize it. Now here's where this applies directly to you. You don't need to be Apple. You just need to understand the model. Borrow at a rate lower than your return. Use that borrowed capital to buy cash-flowing assets. Let the assets service the debt while you keep the upside. That is it. That is the entire playbook. The execution requires discipline. The math requires honesty. And the psychology requires rewiring almost everything you were taught. But the principle is not complicated. So how do you actually start using this? First, separate your debt into two columns. Column 1, debt that costs you and creates no return. Credit cards, car loans on depreciating vehicles, personal loans spent on lifestyle. This debt gets eliminated as fast as possible. No argument. Column 2, debt that is secured against an asset that cash flows or appreciates. Mortgages on income-producing property, business loans with measurable returns, margin loans against appreciating portfolios. This debt gets evaluated by the spread, not by the emotion. Second, learn to read cash flow before you borrow. The single most important number in any leveraged investment is this. Does this asset generate enough income to cover the debt payment and still leave money over? If the answer is yes, you have a candidate. If the answer is no, you have a liability dressed as an asset. This is where most people fail. They fall in love with the asset and forget to interrogate the numbers. Third, build a buffer. Leverage positions require reserves. If you borrow to buy a rental property, you need 6 months of mortgage payments sitting in cash. If you use margin, you need room to handle a drawdown without a for sale. Leverage amplifies gains, but it also amplifies losses. The buffer is not optional. It is what separates smart leverage from reckless gambling. Here's a real-world way to think about this. Imagine two investors, both buy the same rental property, same price, same mortgage rate. Investor 1 puts down the minimum and keeps no cash reserve. Investor 2 puts down slightly more and keeps 6 months of payments liquid. 6 months later, the tenant leaves. Property sits empty for 2 months. Investor 1 misses a mortgage payment. Credit takes a hit. Lender calls. Stress goes through the roof. They sell a loss just to get out. Investor 2 covers the gap from reserves. Find a new tenant. Moves on. Same asset. Same market. Completely different outcome. The difference wasn't intelligence. It was preparation. The reason most people fail with leverage is impatience. They want results in 90 days. Wealthy investors think in 10-year cycles. A rental property might barely break even in year 1. By year 5, rents have risen, the loan is being paid down, and the property has appreciated. By year 10, you're looking at a completely different picture. Compounding doesn't happen in quarters. It happens in decades. And debt, used correctly, is fuel for that compounding engine. Let's step back for a second. Everything covered here comes down to one fundamental shift. Average people ask, how do I avoid owing money? Wealthy people ask, how do I make borrowed money work harder than my own? Those are two entirely different questions, and they lead to two entirely different financial lives. The truth is, debt is not moral or immoral. It is not good or bad in the abstract. It is a mechanism, like fire. It can warm your house or burn it down. The outcome depends entirely on how you use it. Here's something worth sitting with. If you have spent your entire adult life avoiding debt at all costs, and you have nothing to show for it beyond a paid-off car and a savings account losing ground to inflation, the problem was never the debt. The problem was the framework you were given for thinking about money. And that framework can be changed. Not overnight, but it can be changed. Now let's be honest about what goes wrong. Because not everyone who uses leverage ends up wealthy. Some people use it and lose everything. And the difference matters. Mistake 1. Borrowing to consume. A car loan on a vehicle that loses 20% of its value the second you drive it off the lot. That is not leverage. That is subtraction. Stop dressing it up as anything else. Mistake 2. Over-leveraging. Borrowing 95% of the value of an asset with no buffer and no cash flow. One vacancy, one market shift, one unexpected repair, and you're underwater. The richest investors almost never max out their leverage. They leave room. Always. Mistake 3. Ignoring the spread. Borrowing at 8% to invest in something returning 6. That is negative leverage. You're paying to lose money. The spread must be positive. Non negociable. Mistake 4. Thinking short-term with long-term assets. Real estate, business equity, portfolio building. These are decade-long plays. If you need the money back in 2 years, leverage is the wrong tool for you right now. Timing matters. Here's the big picture. The wealthy didn't build generational wealth by working harder. They built it by understanding how money moves. They understood that there are 2 ways to make money work. You can earn it, or you can control it. Debt, used strategically, gives you control over capital you haven't earned yet. And that changes the entire timeline. Think about this. If you save $1,000 a month for 30 years at a 5% return, you end up with roughly $800,000. If you use that same saving discipline, but also leverage $200,000 in income-producing real estate early in that same 30 years, the outcome is dramatically different. Not because you earn more, because you deployed capital more effectively. This is the part people overlook. Time is the most expensive variable in wealth building. And debt, used correctly, compresses time. It lets you control a $200,000 asset today, instead of in 12 years when you've finally saved enough. And those 12 years of appreciation, cash flow, and compounding, you can never get those back. Let's be clear about one last thing. This is not permission to go borrow recklessly. This is not a guarantee that debt always works. And this is definitely not financial advice. What this is a challenge to examine the beliefs you inherited about debt. And ask honestly, are they serving you? Or are they just comfortable? The rich don't fear debt. They study it. They respect it. They use it with precision. And when you start doing the same, you stop being a passenger in someone else's financial system, and you start building your own. One more thing before you go. The next time someone tells you debt is always dangerous, ask them one question. What kind of debt? Because that one question separates people who understand money from people who just have opinions about it. Debt that pays you is not the same as debt that drains you. A mortgage on a cash-flowing property is not the same as a maxed-out credit card. A business loan that generates returns is not the same as a car note on a vehicle you don't need. The language matters. The category matters. The math matters. And once you start thinking this way, you will never look at a loan statement the same way again.